Nobel laureate Malala Yousafzai was only 10 years old when the Taliban arrived in her hometown in Pakistan. As their attacks on women's and girls' freedoms rapidly escalated, Malala took action, speaking out in support of girls' right to education and against militant fundamentalism, even as she and her family faced death threats. When Malala was 15, the Taliban shot and nearly killed her. She survived and continues her activism to this day. I Am Malala is her story, a New York Times bestseller. In our guide, we'll first examine the early influences that made Malala who she is, focusing on how her family, and, in particular, her father, was willing to defy tradition and fundamentalist religious views to raise her in an environment of compassion, gender equality, and secular education. Next, we'll explore how Malala and her father came of age against the backdrop of the Taliban's rise to power. We'll discuss the origins of the terrorist group and its takeover of the Swat Valley, where Malala lived with her family. Then, we'll look at Malala's campaign for girls' education and against the Taliban, including her refusal to abide by the Taliban's ban on girls' education, her TV and radio speeches, her diary of a Pakistani schoolgirl blog for the BBC, and her participation in a New York Times documentary about the Taliban's closure of girls' schools. We'll discuss her shooting at the hands of the Taliban and her continued fight for girls' education even after nearly losing her life. Throughout this guide, we'll provide historical, political, and religious context for the events in Malala's life. We'll also examine the research and data behind issues such as gender according to Islam, the origins of terrorist organizations, the link between misogyny and violent extremism, and girls' education worldwide. New section: Malala's family valued compassion, gender equality, and education. How did a child born into poverty in a society that valued boys over girls and religious tradition over secular education become a Nobel-winning activist for girls' education? In this section, we'll examine the early influences that made Malala who she is, focusing on how her family was willing to defy tradition and fundamentalist religious views to raise her in an environment of compassion, gender equality, and secular education. Malala was born into poverty in the Swat Valley of Pakistan. Malala was born in 1997 in the Swat Valley of Pakistan. Called the Switzerland of the East, it was a beautiful, mountainous region full of rivers and lakes. It attracted wealthy tourists from all over the world. Short-form note: although Malala describes the Swat Valley of her childhood as a type of paradise, she points out later in the book that as the Taliban rose to power in the area, they destroyed many of Swat's treasured landmarks. They blew up Buddhist statues that were thousands of years old. Climate change has also taken a toll on the area, increasing the frequency and severity of weather events like floods. Foreign tourism, once a mainstay of the economy in Swat, has declined significantly over the years. When Malala was young, her family was very poor. They lived in a two-room shack opposite the school her father, Jia-ud-Din, had co-founded. They had no bathroom or kitchen. Malala's mother, Tur Pekai, cooked over a fire on the ground. Later, they moved to a one-story concrete house. Short-form note: poverty has long been a problem in Pakistan. In the late 1990s, when Malala was an infant, the poverty rate in Pakistan was around 60%. It declined to around 20% by 2019, but rose again to nearly 40% by 2023. While many factors contribute to poverty in Pakistan, the World Bank has emphasized the role played by powerful vested interests in the military, politics, and business, which control the country's policy decisions. The Pakistani government has said that a low level of investment in education is also a major cause of poverty in the country. Malala's Pashtun family valued hospitality and compassion. Malala belongs to the Pashtun tribe. Pashtuns live in both Pakistan and Afghanistan. They inhabited the region long before the British drew the dividing line between the two countries. Short-form note: Pakistan is a melting pot of ethnicities, cultures, and languages. It has 6 major ethnic groups: Punjabi, Pashtun, Sindhi, Saraiki, Mohajer, and Balochi. Approximately 40% of Pakistanis are Punjabi. Pashtuns are the second largest ethnic group in Pakistan, comprising about 18% of the population. Languages spoken in Pakistan include Urdu, English, Punjabi, Pashto, and many others. Pashtun's most important values are honor and hospitality. Malala's family also valued generosity and compassion toward the less fortunate. For example, Ziauddin let poor children enroll in his school free of charge. When the school eventually grew to 800 students, 100 of them were attending tuition free. Malala's mother let some of these children live with the family, and she fed breakfast to other students because she said it was hard for them to learn when they were hungry. Like her parents, Malala was motivated by compassion for the poor. There was a huge trash heap down the street from her house because there was no garbage collection in Swat. When she saw some children there, collecting recyclable waste to sell, Malala begged her father to give the children free places at his school. He explained that they were probably the breadwinners for their families, so if they went to school, their families would go hungry. Instead, he started a local campaign arguing for the education of these poor children. Malala learned an early lesson about compassion versus revenge from her parents. She had a toy cell phone that disappeared one day, and Malala thought her friend had stolen it. In retaliation, Malala began stealing her friend's toys. When Malala's mother found out, Malala initially lied and said she hadn't done it, but then she confessed. She cried and apologized to her mother, who then took Malala to apologize to her friend. Malala never lied or stole again. Afterward, her father consoled her by telling her stories of great leaders who had made mistakes. Malala learned that everyone makes mistakes, what matters is what you learn from them. This influenced her belief that the Pashtun emphasis on revenge was wrong. Instead of hurting someone who hurt you, as was the Pashtun practice, Malala believed you should teach them to do better. Modeling compassion and generosity to children. By engaging in generous and honorable acts themselves, Malala's parents were taking part in one of the most powerful methods of teaching children empathy for the less fortunate, modeling. Studies have shown that kids are more likely to share with others or give winnings away when they see other people modeling this behavior. Research also demonstrates that highly altruistic people generally had parents who were also altruistic. These parents practiced what they preached and had strong positive relationships with their kids, which encouraged the children to model their behavior after their parents. Malala's parents modeled generosity, hospitality, and integrity by educating, housing, and feeding poor children, starting a campaign to educate children who collected trash for a living, and accompanying Malala to apologize to her friend when Malala stole her toys. The latter act not only taught Malala to apologize when she'd done something wrong, but it also encouraged her to have compassion for her friend even though Malala believed her friend had stolen her toy cell phone. Gender roles in Malala's family and Pashtun society. Malala's family were traditional Pashtun Muslims in many ways, but when it came to gender roles, they frequently defied tradition. Pashtun marriages are usually arranged, but Malala's parents married for love. Malala says that many Pashtun men physically abuse their wives, but Ziauddin cherished Turpekai and would never do such a thing. Ziauddin also talked his problems over with Turpekai and listened to her advice, even though in Pashtun society it's seen as weak for men to share problems with women. Short-form note, the vast majority of marriages in Pakistan, 80% or more, are arranged. Typically, family members arrange a marriage as a way to create an alliance between two families. Families evaluate prospective matches based on factors such as tribal affiliation and caste rather than love or romance. However, marriages based on love have become more popular among recent generations. Same-sex marriages are illegal in Pakistan. For Pashtuns, the birth of a girl is considered a disappointment, as they believe that women's sole function is to prepare food and give birth. But when Malala was born, her father believed there was something unique about her. He asked people to throw dried fruits, sweets, and coins into her cradle, even though that was a Pashtun custom reserved for boys. Malala was proud to be Pashtun, but she didn't agree with some aspects of the Pashtun code of behavior, or Pashtunwali, especially in regard to women. As a young girl, Malala played cricket in the streets and on the rooftops with her neighbor friends, but she knew that as soon as she got a little older she wouldn't be so free. Pashtun women and older girls were expected to stay inside, cooking for and serving the men and boys in the family. Women and girls weren't allowed to leave the home without a male relative. Malala's mother and aunts had not been allowed to attend school. Turpekai couldn't read or write. However, as Malala got older, her parents supported her not only in continuing her education, but also in speaking out publicly against the Taliban. Malala's family often went to stay with her father's family in the mountain village where he grew up. There, women couldn't leave the house without covering their faces, and they weren't allowed to speak with men unless they were close relatives. Malala did not cover her face in the village, even when she became a teenager. The people in the village criticized her, but her father defended her. Gender according to the Pashtunwali and Islam. Like Malala's family, almost all Pashtuns are Sunni Muslims who follow both the Pashtunwali and the precepts of Islam. As Malala points out, the Pashtunwali places severe restrictions on the role of women in society. While some fundamentalist interpretations of Islam take a similar approach, other modernist interpretations see women and men as equals. The Pashtunwali is an unwritten set of moral codes and rules of behavior passed down through many centuries. Originally, it had no links to Islam. However, Pashtuns converted to Islam in the 7th century, and Islam then became part of their culture and their code of conduct. While the Pashtunwali thus contains many aspects of Islam, the two are not the same. Some experts say that the Pashtun perception of Islam is quite different from that of other adherents, because it's filtered through the Pashtunwali. Of course, as with all religions, interpretations of Islam generally differ depending on who is doing the interpreting. According to the Pashtunwali and some interpretations of Islam, women should have limited rights. Some interpretations of Islam, however, hold that women and men are equal. These interpretations tend to rely less on cultural traditions or laws in Islamic societies and more on the Quran itself, which, they argue, states that men and women are equal in the eyes of God and gives women rights like the right to an education, the right to refuse a husband, and the right to own and inherit property. Throughout I Am Malala, Malala gives examples of instances when the Taliban or the Pakistani government invoked the Quran to subjugate women, even though Malala and her father observed that the text of the Quran itself did not support treating women as inferiors. The value of education in Malala's family. Malala's family had a long tradition of valuing secular education. Her grandfather taught theology in a government high school and was an imam at the local mosque. He sent Ziauddin to the government school rather than the religious madrasa, even though people criticized him for this because he was a religious leader himself. Malala's grandfather was also an avid reader and cared about the rights of the poor and disadvantaged, values he passed on to his son. Malala's father dreamed of starting his own school, but his family was poor and had no connections. He nonetheless managed to attend a good university and, although he encountered many setbacks, he eventually founded a school. Over time, the school grew and expanded to 3 locations. Ziauddin became known in the community for his willingness to speak up and criticize the government and the army. Malala grew up in her father's school, sitting in on classes and admiring the teachers. When she started attending school herself, she loved it. She had an ongoing rivalry with her best friend over who would get the top marks in their class, and Malala almost always won. Religious and secular education in Pakistan. As Malala notes, there are 2 systems of education in Pakistan: Islamic religious education at madrasas and secular education at either government-run or private schools. The tradition of madrasas dates back almost 1,000 years. Historically, their purpose was not to educate the general population, but to train future religious scholars and clerics. Until the 1980s, there were only a few hundred madrasas in Pakistan. However, as discussed in more detail below, in 1977 General Zia came to power and began a campaign of Islamization that included opening thousands of madrasas throughout the 1980s. By 2001, there were approximately 45,000 madrasas in Pakistan. These schools became popular in part because Pakistan's secular public education system was so poor. For years, Pakistan has spent only 2 to 3% of its gross national output on public education, one of the lowest rates in the world. Government-run schools frequently lack teachers, books, and electricity, and are plagued by corruption. In the 1980s and 1990s, and continuing to today, families who could not afford to send their sons to private schools sent them to madrasas, which provided free room and board. Unlike their predecessors, some schools in this new generation of madrasas taught a violent version of Islam, which preached war, suicide attacks, and the killing of innocent civilians in the name of religion. These madrasas were both a training ground and a recruitment pool for terrorist groups, including the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. While most madrasas are not affiliated with radical militant groups, they nonetheless fail to teach the basics of secular education needed in the modern job market, leading to high rates of unemployment and creating a roadblock to Pakistan's economic development. New section: Malala and her father came of age during the Taliban's rise to power. While Malala's identity was influenced by her family's positive values, both she and her father were also shaped by the rise of the Taliban during their lifetimes. In this section, we'll first discuss Malala's perspective on the origins of the Taliban in the 1980s and 1990s. Then, we'll examine the terrorist group's increasing power in the Swat Valley after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. The origins of the Taliban in Pakistan. Malala explains that during her and her family's lifetimes, Pakistan has been ruled by a series of military dictators who maintained control in part by emphasizing the people's religious duty to obey the government. In this section, we'll examine how the actions of these dictators laid the groundwork for the rise of the Taliban. Next, we'll look at why Malala's own father almost joined the Taliban as a teenager. Pakistani dictators and the creation of the Taliban. In 1977, when Malala's father was 8, there was a military coup in Pakistan, and a general named Muhammad Zia-ul-Haq seized control from the elected prime minister. General Zia tried to win the support of the Pakistani people by campaigning to make Pakistan a strict Muslim country and arguing that it was the people's religious duty to obey his government. Many madrasas were opened during his rule, and Islamic studies became a required class in secular schools. Zia also enacted many laws curtailing women's rights. Short-form note: Britain partitioned Pakistan from India along religious lines. India was primarily Hindu and Pakistan was primarily Muslim. Despite Pakistan's large Muslim population, however, the government of Pakistan remained secular following its 1947 independence from Britain. For years, Pakistan was divided over the role of Islam in politics. This ended with Zia's coup. Zia's Islamization of Pakistan went hand in hand with his legal and social programs to reverse women's rights and emphasize their domestic role as a key aspect of Muslim life. Then, the Soviet Union invaded Pakistan's neighbor, Afghanistan, in 1979. Millions of Afghans fled to Pakistan. General Zia accepted them as refugees and began a program to train them as mujahideen, or resistance fighters. These mujahideen eventually became the Taliban. Short-form note: in Arabic, the term mujahideen means anyone who takes part in a jihad, or a struggle for the sake of Islam. In English, mujahideen is more specifically defined as Islamic guerrilla fighters, and jihad means a holy war waged on behalf of Islam as a religious duty. Malala writes that in training these fighters, Zia gained favor with the U.S., for whom the Soviet Union was the primary enemy in the Cold War. Western countries sent billions of dollars and weapons to help Pakistan's Military Intelligence Service, ISI, train men to fight the Soviet Union's Communist Army. Zia also gained favor with the Arab world, which saw the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan as an attack by infidels on a fellow Muslim country. Short-form note: during the 1980s, the CIA provided $2 to $3 billion in covert assistance to Pakistan to train 80,000 Afghan mujahideen. Pakistan trained about 90,000 mujahideen in total, including the founder of the Afghan Taliban, Mullah Omar. Clerics in the mosques began to preach about the Soviet invasion, saying it was the Pakistani people's duty as Muslims to join the jihad against the Soviet infidels. Short-form note: as a result of this support for jihad, in the mid to late 1990s, approximately 80,000 to 100,000 Pakistanis fought in Afghanistan on the side of the Taliban. Some sources estimate that 20 to 40% of Taliban soldiers in Afghanistan were Pakistani. Pakistani political parties recruited volunteer Taliban fighters from the madrasas, which became increasingly militant. In addition, Pakistan provided logistical support and supplies to the Afghan Taliban. After 9 years, the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan beginning in 1988. On September 11, 2001, the terrorist attacks in the U.S. happened. The leader of the al-Qaeda terrorist organization, Osama bin Laden, was living in Kandahar, Afghanistan at the time. America sent thousands of troops to Afghanistan to catch him and overthrow the Taliban regime that had protected him. Just as America had needed Pakistan's help to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan, it also needed Pakistan's help to fight the Taliban in Afghanistan. As a result, America embraced General Pervez Musharraf, who was Pakistan's president at the time, and who agreed to help the U.S. with its war on terror. Short-form note: the War on Terror is a global military campaign initiated by former U.S. President George W. Bush to combat terrorism following the 9/11 attacks and continued through successive administrations. While the War on Terror succeeded in toppling the Taliban regime in Afghanistan and eliminating many of al-Qaeda's senior members, including Osama bin Laden in 2011, critics argue that it often employed illegal tactics to do so, including detaining people without trial at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and using torture to extract confessions. Malala writes that because Pakistan's intelligence service, ISI, had essentially created the Taliban, many ISI officers were close to Taliban leaders. So even as Pakistan assisted the Americans, they were still providing weapons to Taliban fighters and sheltering their leaders in Pakistan. In 2004, the Americans launched a drone attack in a region of Pakistan where they believed Osama bin Laden was hiding. They followed that attack with 2 more, killing over 100 Pakistanis. As a result of these attacks and Pakistan's support for the U.S. war on terror, militancy and anti-government sentiment began to grow within Pakistan. This eventually contributed to the emergence of the Pakistani Taliban. Short-form note: just as many fighters in the Afghan Taliban were Pakistani, many leaders of the Pakistani Taliban were veterans of the war in Afghanistan. These men had long provided support for the fight against the Soviets in Afghanistan. In the late 2000s, spurred on by their anger at Musharraf's support for America's war on terror, they also began to direct their militancy toward their own government. Conditions that contributed to radicalization: the example of Malala's father. Although Malala's father eventually became an outspoken critic of the Taliban and a founder of secular schools, his experience as a teenager demonstrates how young men in Pakistan could become susceptible to radicalization. Malala recounts how Jihad grew up in a poor village with few opportunities. Although he attended a secular school, he also studied the Quran with a religious scholar when he was a teenager. His teacher constantly talked about jihad, saying it was the right choice because life on earth was short and there were few work opportunities in the village. Jihad was influenced by his teacher and was afraid of working in the dangerous coal mines like many of the men in his village, so he decided he wanted to become a jihadi. Jihad later told Malala that he believed he was subjected to a type of brainwashing. Some of the boys from Jihad-din's district were recruited to wage holy war against the Soviets alongside the Taliban in Afghanistan. Years later, the same organization that recruited them became the Swat Taliban. One of the things that changed Jihad-din's mind about becoming a jihadi was spending time with his future wife's family. They belonged to secular nationalist parties and were opposed to Pakistan's involvement in the Afghan war. Why do people join terrorist organizations? While research about why people join terrorist organizations is inconclusive, experts suggest that Jihad-din's reasons for wanting to join the Taliban are typical. Contrary to the popular belief that terrorism is the product of mental illness or psychopathy, experts believe that people who join terrorist groups are frequently motivated by social conditions, such as poverty, lack of education, or lack of political power. Becoming a terrorist or jihadi not only provides these individuals with a sense of belonging, it also provides opportunities for power and advancement to those who otherwise have few work opportunities. Scholars generally agree that terrorism is best understood as a question of political and group dynamics, rather than as a matter of individual psychology. One example of this is the role of some madrasas in training members of the Taliban to wage jihad in Afghanistan. Poor students generally enrolled in the madrasas because of the free room and board, not out of a sincere desire to become a terrorist. But in the isolated, strict environment of the madrasas, they were particularly susceptible to being indoctrinated into radical militant beliefs. The Taliban attacked girls' education and women's freedoms in Malala's province. After September 11, the Taliban and militant fundamentalists associated with them increasingly attempted to curtail women's and girls' freedoms in Malala's province. The process began slowly, with various fundamentalist groups spreading their belief that Islamic law prohibits women's freedoms. Then, in 2007, the Taliban entered the Swat Valley, and the violence and threats escalated, including the Taliban's first threat against Malala's family. Precursors to the Taliban in the Swat Valley. In 2002, the MMA alliance won the elections in Malala's province. They were a group of 5 religious parties, including the one that had run the madrasas where the Taliban were trained. The MMA tore down billboards featuring pictures of women or covered the images with black paint. They took female mannequins from clothing shops and insisted women wear head coverings. Malala's father opened his high school in 2003. At the time, boys and girls were in the same classes. But by the following year, the atmosphere in the province had changed so much that having co-ed classes was no longer an option. In 2005, a massive 7.6 earthquake hit Pakistan, killing over 73,000 people. The Movement for the Enforcement of Islamic Law, or TNSM, a group that had sent men to fight alongside the Taliban in Afghanistan, and was now led by Maulana Fazlullah, provided some aid to remote villages that the government hadn't been able to help. Taking advantage of the atmosphere of fear created by the earthquake, mullahs, religious leaders, from the TNSM preached that the earthquake was a punishment from God for women's freedoms and obscenity. The mullahs warned that if people did not adopt Sharia, or Islamic law, God would send more severe punishments. Short-form note: terrorist groups often exploit crises, whether political, economic, or humanitarian, to further their agenda. Like the TNSM, they may use natural disasters to warn people against behavior they deem sinful. They may also take advantage of crises to gain political credibility and demonstrate that they have value to the community beyond armed conflict, a tactic that's especially effective in areas where government services are lacking. For example, jihadist groups such as the Taliban, Hezbollah, and Al-Shabaab provided health services during the COVID-19 pandemic when the government was unable to do so effectively. The Taliban's imposition of increasingly harsh Sharia law in the Swat Valley. Malala was 10 when the Taliban came to the Swat Valley, seemingly appearing out of nowhere. The Taliban fighters were armed with knives and Kalashnikovs, assault rifles, and wore black badges that said Sharia law or martyrdom. Their leader was 28-year-old Fazlullah. He set up a radio station in the Swat Valley known as Mullah FM, and people called him the Radio Mullah. Many people in Swat got all of their information from the radio because they didn't have a TV or were illiterate. Short-form note: the literacy rate in Pakistan ranged from about 54% to 59% from 2006 to 2019. Men's literacy in Pakistan has long been significantly higher than women's. Soon, says Malala, the Radio Mullah began telling people to stop listening to music, watching movies, and dancing, activities that he said were sinful and had caused the earthquake. Malala asked her father if the Quran really prohibited those things, and Ziauddin told her that the Radio Mullah was making it up. However, many people were fed up with the slow-moving and corrupt Pakistani justice system, so they agreed with Fazlullah's ideas about bringing back Islamic law. 6 months after Mullah FM began broadcasting, people started heeding Fazlullah's admonishments to get rid of their TVs, CDs, and DVDs. The Taliban gathered the electronics in huge piles and burned them in the streets. Malala's family hid their TV in a cupboard and watched it on low volume. Short-form note: the Taliban in both Pakistan and Afghanistan banned all forms of entertainment and most forms of independent media, claiming that music, movies, and TV shows were un-Islamic, immoral, and obscene. While these prohibitions purported to be on religious grounds, in reality, they allowed the Taliban to maintain authoritarian control over the flow of information to the Pakistani and Afghan people, as well as to the outside world. Fazlullah often preached directly to women, instructing them to stay home and go outside only in emergencies. Malala was confused by this because she knew that the Quran did not say that women should stay home and only men could go out. But even Malala's mother believed that the Quran prohibited women from leaving the home without a male relative. Soon, the radio mullah was preaching that girls should not go to school. On his radio program, he named girls who had quit school and congratulated them, saying they'd go to heaven. He also told women not to go shopping at the bazaar. If they did try to go, the Taliban would shout at and intimidate them until they went home. Short-form note: the practice of secluding women from public observation and enforcing high standards of female modesty is called purdah. Purdah limits interactions between men and women, as well as limiting women's ability to move freely outside the home. In the Muslim tradition, it begins at puberty. Some fundamentalist Islamic states, like Iran and Taliban-run Afghanistan, punish women merely for leaving the house or wearing the veil in a manner deemed improper. But Islamic modernists argue that the Quran does not require women to stay home or wear a veil, and that women have the same right to participate in public affairs as men. Then Fazlullah began holding local courts called shura to resolve disputes. The shura instituted public whippings as punishments. Fazlullah set up a stage where people were flogged in front of cheering crowds. Next, he established a morality police who patrolled the streets in pickup trucks, wielding machine guns. One day, when Malala and her family were passing through a Taliban checkpoint, Taliban soldiers carrying Kalashnikovs told Malala and her mother that their failure to wear burqas was shameful. When the family returned home, they found a note from the Taliban on the gates of Ziauddin's school. It threatened severe punishment unless the school stopped teaching girls. While all this was happening, the authorities and the people did nothing to stop it. Malala's father said that people had been seduced by Fazlullah. However, clashes between the Taliban and the Pakistani government in Islamabad, the capital of Pakistan, led Musharraf to send the army into the Swat Valley. This was the beginning of a conflict between the army and the Swat Taliban that would last for years. It was hard for Malala to sleep at night because of all the noise from the machine guns and cannons. The army succeeded in driving Fazlullah and his fighters into the mountains, but within a week, 40 Taliban leaders from across Malala's province met to form a united front. They called themselves the TTP, or Pakistan Taliban. Besides fighting government forces, they also acted as a morality police, targeting women who weren't observing purdah. Benazir Bhutto, a former prime minister who had recently returned from exile, gave a speech in which she condemned the militants. Immediately after the speech, she was assassinated. Many Pakistanis, including Malala, felt that their hope for democracy and women's rights in the country died along with her. Misogyny, domestic violence, and violent extremism. While the Taliban's violent repression affected everyone in the Swat Valley, it was overwhelmingly directed at women and girls. Research helps explain this link between extremism and violence against women. Some researchers have called misogyny, the hatred of or desire to control women, a gateway to extremism. Their studies show that worldwide, men who join violent extremist groups or embrace extremist ideologies are frequently motivated by the promise of a society in which women are subservient to men. By the same token, terrorist groups recruit members by glorifying strict gender roles in which women are relegated to the domestic sphere. In addition, because misogyny dehumanizes women and often goes hand in hand with violence against women, it prepares men to accept other violent ideologies and commit violent acts. This may be one reason extremist violence is more likely to take hold in countries like Pakistan, which already have a poor track record when it comes to gender equality. However, research also demonstrates that even in countries like the US where women have more rights, misogyny leads to violent extremism. Studies show that men who have a history of domestic violence commit almost 70% of mass shootings in the US. Experts say that men who believe it's acceptable to control or abuse women are more likely to commit violent acts against strangers. Author Rebecca Solnit argues in Men Explain Things to Me that the true source of male violence in the U.S. is not mental illness or economic problems, as many claim, but a belief that men have the right to control women. Solnit draws a direct line between misogyny and violence against women, on the one hand, and mass shootings and terrorism, on the other. New section: Malala campaigned for girls' education and against the Taliban. Surrounded by the Taliban's increasing violence and attacks on women and girls, Malala did what she believed was right. She continued going to school despite the Taliban's ban and, encouraged by her father, she spoke out in support of girls' education. In this section, we look at Malala's campaign for girls' education in the face of serious risks, including the Taliban's bombings and closures of schools, the evacuation of the Swat Valley due to fighting between the army and the Taliban, and the continued death threats against Malala and her father. We'll discuss Malala's shooting at the hands of the Taliban. Finally, we'll explore how she survived and continued her fight for girls' education from her new home in England. Malala spoke out in support of girls' education and against the Taliban. Malala continued going to school despite the Taliban's prohibition on girls' education. She hid her book bag on the way there and back, and didn't wear her uniform to avoid detection by the Taliban. The fighting continued in the Swat Valley in 2007 and 2008. Fazlullah started blowing up schools, usually after the night curfew when no one was in them. There were school bombings almost every day. One of them killed 10 members of Malala's best friend's family. By the end of 2008, the Taliban had destroyed over 400 schools. Some of the Pashtun elders in Swat, including Jia-ud-Din, banded together to challenge Fazlullah. They spoke out against the Taliban by giving interviews on radio programs like Voice of America and the BBC. Malala's father encouraged her to speak up, and she began giving interviews as well. She started when she was 11 by doing group interviews with her classmates, in which they spoke about girls dropping out of school because of the Taliban. But when her classmates reached 13 and 14, the men in their families didn't want them to give interviews anymore because they were afraid the Taliban would punish them for not observing purdah after puberty. Malala had the support of her father and believed it was important to speak the truth, so she continued. She believed God would protect her because she was doing what was right. Jia-ud-Din's friend, a BBC radio correspondent, called him looking for a female teacher or student to write a weekly diary about life under the Taliban. Malala volunteered to do it. They had a computer, but there were frequent power cuts and little internet access, so the correspondent interviewed Malala over the phone and wrote up her thoughts. She used a pseudonym, Gul Makai, and couldn't tell anyone she was writing the diary because it was too dangerous. The diary garnered international attention. Malala began to see the power of the written word. Short-form note: while Malala's diary gained international attention, at home she received a lot of backlash with people calling her a drama queen, accusing her of blasphemy, and even saying she was a CIA agent. But Pashtun girls changed their opinion of her once they read her diary. Many were inspired to write their own diaries and became more eager to go to school. At the end of 2008, the Taliban announced that all girls' schools must shut down by January 15. On the day Malala's school shut down, she and her classmates stayed late playing, and then she went home and cried. After that, she did as many TV and radio interviews as she could. She said that the Taliban could close the schools, but they couldn't stop girls from learning. However, she feared it would be very hard to learn, much less get a job, without school. After the Taliban banned girls' education, Pakistanis spoke out in a way they hadn't before. The Taliban agreed to lift the ban for girls up to 10 years old. Malala was 11, but she and others her age pretended they were younger, so they could start going to school again. The fight for gender equity in education worldwide. The serious obstacles Malala faced in attempting to get an education under the Taliban are in many ways representative of what girls all over the world experience. And like Malala, many individuals and organizations are fighting for gender equity in education worldwide. Although education is a human right, 129 million girls are out of school worldwide, and only 49% of countries have achieved gender parity in education. In the bottom 10 countries for girls' education, countries like Pakistan and Nigeria, the vast majority of girls do not attend any type of secondary school, meaning that their education ends at age 11. In Afghanistan, where the Taliban returned to power in 2021, 2 decades after being overthrown by the US, girls are completely banned from attending school after the 6th grade. Like Malala, many girls face threats to their education due to armed conflict and gender bias resulting from cultural or religious norms. Other common barriers to girls' education include poverty, child marriage, and gender-based violence. While boys face some of these obstacles as well, families with fewer resources often favor boys when investing in education. Although the reasons girls are unable to attend school vary by country and community, research demonstrates that the benefits of girls' education are universal. Girls' education improves economies and creates more stable societies. Women who receive a primary and secondary education are more likely to be employed, make more money, and provide better nutrition and health care for their families. They're less likely to experience discrimination, gender-based violence, and child marriage. Because the need for gender equity in education is great, and the benefits to society are significant, many organizations are working globally to advance girls' education, from CampFed in Africa to Girls Who Code in the US to Malala's own nonprofit, the Malala Fund, founded after her shooting. These nonprofits advocate for policy change, provide teacher training and student mentoring, and work to remove the barriers to girls' education. Malala's family fled the Swat Valley. Finally, the Pakistani army launched a more intensive effort to drive the Taliban out of Swat. The government told people to evacuate. Malala's family tried to stay, but the fighting left them constantly anxious. They left the Swat Valley along with almost 2 million internally displaced persons, IDPs. Malala and her family were away from their home for about 3 months. When they returned, they found buildings in ruins, piles of wreckage, and walls covered with bullet holes. The Taliban was no longer in charge, but Malala feared that they could return at any minute. She had nightmares about it. Life began to regain a semblance of normalcy. But just when people started to think the Taliban was really gone, there was a series of bombings, kidnappings, and murders. Ziauddin continued to speak out against the Taliban, and he received another death threat. IDPs, evacuations, and international humanitarian law. IDPs like Malala's family are generally defined as people who are forced to flee their homes to avoid the effects of war, violence, human rights violations, or disasters, and who have not crossed an international border. Evacuation orders due to armed conflict are a common cause of such internal displacement. International humanitarian law governs how and when governments can order civilian evacuations like the one in the Swat Valley. Governments can't displace civilian populations to gain a strategic advantage in war. Rather, evacuations must be carried out only for the safety of the population, or because there is no military alternative to evacuation. In addition, the military can order evacuations only if there is a safe place for people to evacuate to. Civilians can't be evacuated to a region where they're still in danger. Malala's profile continued to rise. Meanwhile, Malala received many awards for speaking out for girls' education, and she continued to give interviews to TV and print journalists. During one speech at a gala, she spoke publicly for the first time about defying the Taliban's orders and going to school in secret. Malala's rising profile attracted attention, and she received a death threat from the Taliban. Although her parents were worried and encouraged her to pause her work, Malala wanted to keep speaking out. She reassured herself with the thought that the Taliban had never targeted a young girl. She was more worried about her father than herself. Nonetheless, Malala started having nightmares about the Taliban shooting her or throwing acid in her face. At night after everyone was asleep, she double-checked that every door and window in the house was locked and prayed that her family and all of Swat would be protected from the Taliban. Children in conflict zones. Malala frequently mentions the fear she experienced as the result of the Taliban's actions and the fighting between the army and the Taliban. Her reactions to this fear, such as nightmares and constant anxiety, are common among children living in conflict zones. Children in Syria, Ukraine, and Gaza, among other places, often live in a state of toxic stress that has long-term consequences for their psychological well-being. These children experience many types of violence, such as bombings, killings, and displacement from their homes. The mental health effects of living in conflict zones are most significant for children who are separated from their parents. Malala's ability to continue her fight despite her fear may have been reinforced by the ongoing love and support of her family. Malala was shot by the Taliban. By the time Malala was 15, she had been speaking out against the Taliban, at increasingly greater personal risk, for 4 years. She and her family had been receiving threats from the Taliban for a year. On October 9, 2012, the Taliban shot Malala. At the time, she and her friends were going to school in secret. There was no longer a sign over the door to the school, and the students arrived by bus, even though the school was only a short walk from their homes, because it wasn't safe to walk. Malala was riding the bus home from school with 19 other girls when Taliban soldiers pulled them over. A man asked for her by name, then shot her in the face point blank. The bullet went through her left eye socket, exited her head, and lodged in her shoulder, narrowly missing her brain. The Taliban later claimed responsibility for shooting Malala. They said they had done it not because of her fight for girls' education, but because she supported Western, secular ideas. Short-form note: almost all terrorist groups use assassination as a terrorism tactic, but terrorists have committed far more assassinations in Pakistan than in any other country where assassinations occur. According to the U.S. government, while terrorist groups commit assassinations to eliminate enemies, they also do so to intimidate the population of a region, influence public opinion, or garner media attention, among other reasons. Malala was rushed to a series of hospitals, where doctors operated on her to remove the bullet and relieve life-threatening swelling in her brain. She suffered complications after the operations and was transferred to a hospital in Birmingham, England. Malala's family had trouble getting out of Pakistan to join her, so for her first 10 days at the English hospital, she was alone. When she regained consciousness in Birmingham, she had no idea what had happened, where she was, or why her vision and hearing on her left side weren't working and her thoughts were muddled. She couldn't speak, so she wrote basic phrases in English on a notepad. She couldn't walk properly. Slowly, she regained her speech and practiced walking. When Malala was reunited with her family, everyone released the emotions they had been holding in and cried. Malala's family was distraught to see that the left side of her face was paralyzed, and she couldn't smile. Doctors operated to repair Malala's damaged facial nerve. After 3 months, movement slowly began returning to her face. Short-form note: while Malala started on the road to recovery following her stay in the Birmingham hospital, healing from the shooting would take at least 9 years and 6 surgeries, including 3 additional surgeries to repair her facial paralysis in 2018, 2019, and 2021. When she was recovering in Boston from the 3rd surgery on her face, she heard the news of the Taliban retaking Afghanistan. She noted on social media that millions of Afghan people had taken a bullet at the hands of the Taliban, just as she had. Malala continued her fight for girls' education from her new home in England. The Pakistani government rented an apartment in Birmingham for Malala's family to stay in while she recovered. They paid for her medical care and gave her father a position as education attaché to the Pakistan High Commissioner in London. 6 months after the attack, Malala was well enough to start school in Birmingham. Malala liked England, but she missed home. She couldn't return, however, because it was still dangerous for girls to get an education in Pakistan. Schools were still being bombed and girls killed. Short-form note: after the Pakistani army retook the Swat Valley from the Taliban in 2009, some degree of peace returned to the area. But as Malala points out, the Taliban attacks continued, including their attack on Malala herself. Arguably to guard against another Taliban takeover, the Pakistani military has remained in Swat since 2009. Sporadic Taliban attacks have continued and, following the Afghan Taliban's takeover of Kabul in the summer of 2021, the Pakistani Taliban in Swat began regrouping. In addition to other attacks, the Pakistani Taliban attacked a school van in 2022 on the 10th anniversary of Malala's shooting, killing the driver and injuring students. On Malala's 16th birthday, she gave a speech about girls' education at the UN in New York. She wrote the speech not just for the UN delegates, but for people all over the world whom she hoped to inspire. She also founded the Malala Fund, which works to ensure that girls around the world receive an education. She went to Kenya to build a school, and to Nigeria to show solidarity with schoolgirls abducted by militants. She went to the White House to discuss girls' education with U.S. President Barack Obama. She told the president that instead of trying to root out terrorism through war, the U.S. should work to eliminate terrorism through education. Methods for combating terrorism. Malala's message to President Obama echoes the conclusions of many experts on combating and preventing violent extremism. These experts say that while counterterrorism has long focused on military and security operations, these approaches are not enough to exterminate terrorist groups that are now active in approximately two-thirds of the world. They argue that governments must focus on the roots of violent extremism, poverty and inequality, lack of education, marginalization, and discrimination, including against girls and women, and poor governance, including state violation of human rights and the rule of law. The best way to prevent terrorism, these experts argue, is to create societies that respect human rights and provide economic opportunities for all.